Well, let's look again at the timeline of 6 books of the Bible in the Old Testament that shows the time from about 559 down to 425 BC, and then the 400 silent years before Christ. But it really helps us to understand the timeline of the people coming out of exile and back into Jerusalem, and the writings that occurred during that time frame. So let's take a look at the chart. Going from right to left, going backward in history, we have Malachi, Nehemiah, then we have Esther, Zechariah, Haggai, and Ezra. And so we're going to be looking at Nehemiah today, and we're going to be looking at a time just about overlapping with Malachi, and Nehemiah came back for the rebuilding of the walls, but we're not quite there yet to the walls. And so let's take a look at the timeline in Scripture in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, the trusted cupbearer of the king, his heart is broken over the news of the condition of Jerusalem and its people. King Artaxerxes sees Nehemiah's distress. And we pick up in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Picking up again in verse 7, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let the letters be given for me, the governors of the provinces beyond the river, and that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. 9 and 10, Sanballat and the Amorites are in opposition. Verses 12 through 16, Nehemiah inspects the city's devastation. And then we pick up again in verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them how the hand of God had been favorable to me, also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. And you see in verse 19 that Sanballat and the Amorites had great opposition to this, and yet it didn't faze Nehemiah. Listen to what Nehemiah says in verse 20. So I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion and right or memorial in Jerusalem, he said to Sanballat. Well, there are 5 wonderful truths that we can learn from this small section of Scripture. Number 1, in verse 4, notice that Nehemiah talked to God before he talked to Artaxerxes. He wanted to be sure that God would be with him as he presented his case before the king. Number 2, in verse 3, notice that your face often reveals your heart. Nehemiah's heart was broken over the condition in Jerusalem, and it was shown on his face. And the king, Artaxerxes, even realized what was going on in Nehemiah's life. Number 3, be sure that you know that true godliness, true godly brokenness leads to action. When Nehemiah heard about the terrible condition in Jerusalem, his heart was broken. It was broken for God's people and for the image that would be portrayed of God's action for his people. And it led him to action. Number 4, in verse 18, you'll see that we can accomplish more by working together. When the people saw that Nehemiah had been blessed by God through King Artaxerxes, they were encouraged to join with him in rebuilding the walls. Number 5, verse 20. But even when we're confident, and even when we have some evidence of God's hand, we need to be sure that we trust in him and his power, and then we can accomplish what we need to do. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.